Hey, welcome everyone into part 2 of our wiring diagram series. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you guys really enjoyed the first part. Today we're going to be expanding on that, and we're really going to focus today on what we didn't cover with this diagram in the last class, and then we're going to move on to a new diagram, and we're going to talk about figuring out what is missing and how to figure out what is actually happening in the diagram if you're not given all of the information. But before we get to that, I wanted to let you guys know, stick around for the end of the class. We will have a question for you guys to answer. The first 5 people that answer correctly and send me out an email will receive a GoTech t-shirt, free of charge, of course, and because you guys have earned it. So again, first 5 people, question will be coming up at the end of the class. So make sure you pay attention because likely you'll find the answer inside of this lesson we're getting to today. All right. So before we get to what I want to cover today, guys, if you're not familiar with this diagram, why we have things colored green, yellow, blue, and red, I suggest you go back and watch part 1. That was the foundation for everything we're going to be expanding on today. Now with part 1, guys, came quite a few questions regarding some things that weren't talked about or some things that were maybe a little bit confusing, so I want to clear those up before we get into everything else on this diagram. Our first question here comes from Bernardo, and to paraphrase what he's saying here, he's wondering why we have the blue and the yellow in the diagram, because if you're performing testing, it doesn't actually look like that. It's not a ground circuit there, it's not a power circuit there with the blue. It's a little bit different. You technically have ground on the power and power on the ground, if that makes sense. Bernardo, to simply answer your question, I did not want to draw it that way because I didn't want to induce any confusion to people who may be looking at a diagram for their first time or trying to understand how to trace this. We use switched power and switched ground as a way to visualize what's happening in the circuit because, you know, that's the hardest thing with electricity and electronics in general is visualizing what's happening. That's why we're using switched power and switched ground. But now I'll go ahead and I'll draw it up exactly like you're talking about because that's how we would be testing it with a multimeter in the future. And actually we had a comment regarding testing in itself. So we're going to be getting to actually putting a multimeter to it, testing in a later class. I want to lay the foundation, the groundwork of understanding the diagram before we ever put any tools to it. Because like I said in the last class, if you don't know what's happening in the diagram, you're not going to know what you're testing on the vehicle. All right, Bernardo, here is what it is that you're talking about drawing up. So we'll start off with our power. Start at B+, we'll work down to our splice, and we'll work to our open circuit inside the relay because it's not currently activated. Now here's where it begins to change. This guy right here is a relay winding, so it's really nothing more than a long piece of wire. Our circuit is not technically open at this point, so we will actually have power travel all the way through here, through our decision maker of what RPO code this is, through our splice, down into our BCM, down through our clock spring, all the way down to our horn switch. So in the event of testing this vehicle in its rest state, we will actually read power at our horn switch until it's activated. Once we activate the switch, the horn switch itself, we now switch this to ground. And that's kind of related to another question of explaining switched powers and switched grounds. In this case, we're reading power at all times because we have a relay up there. The windings in there allow the power to travel through it because it's still a complete circuit, giving us power down to our horn switch. When we press the switch, we commit this to ground because our load kicks in. We supply it with ground, it has power, we pull our relay over like it's intended. And then our ground over here, our horns are kind of the same way. They're a winding of wire in each of these horns, which actually will take our ground all the way up to the fuse. So that maybe sounds a little bit confusing. We have ground at a fuse, but the fuse doesn't blow. That's because there's no current traveling through the system right now. And that's why I didn't want to introduce this in part 1, because I didn't want to induce any sort of confusion for people who are just starting off with diagrams. In the rest state, if you're applying a multimeter and you're performing testing on this vehicle, this is what it would look like. And actually we would draw ground in here, we would have ground here. This is what it would look like in its rest state. If you're checking for simply power and ground. This is where our expectation for our testing begins to come in, and we'll explain this more as we get through future classes. But I did want to address your comment, your question, Bernardo. Now note, guys, that not every circuit will be like this, where the ground travels all the way to the fuse and there's power all the way on the ground side. It doesn't always happen that way. It happens that way in this because we're dealing with a relay, which is basically, nothing more than a long piece of wire wound up. And we're dealing with horns, which are the exact same way. There's no open circuit in either of our loads within this circuit. If it were a Hall effect crank sensor, it would be very, very different, okay? And we'll display all that as we work through this series. All right, I think that's about it for the questions that we currently have. If you have any further questions regarding this specific diagram, something doesn't make sense, you want to know how something works, please comment below and I'll either answer it directly in the comment section or I'll include it in part 3 of this series, okay? Now, before we move on from this diagram, there was some information within here that we haven't talked about yet. We haven't talked about the way that we move the wire through the car. So we haven't talked about connectors, we haven't talked about wires and their color, and we haven't talked about connector or pin wiring locations. So that information is included in the diagram as well. We'll start out today with the connectors themselves. So we'll go ahead and we'll grab a black highlighter here, and I'm just going to highlight all the connectors that are visible. X2, X3, 277, X275, X201, X5, X266. Those are all connectors. In this GM diagram, connectors are labeled with X. Now that's not always the case, but you can typically assume, I use that word lightly, but you can typically assume anytime you see a break in the wire like this, that's typically a connector, okay? Not always, but that's typically going to be a connector. So even if it's not labeled with an X, like X201, it's likely a connector. Now you can build upon that with further evidence. If the wire color itself is labeled on either side of the connector, on either side of this little graphic right there, it's likely a connector because wire color can change as it moves through the connector, right? You could go in with a tan color, you could come out with a red color. Just happens to be the way they designed it that day. Now, speaking of wire color, that's also in this diagram as well. Go ahead and erase our connectors. But wire color is one of those things that you want to be careful with because it could have been a late Friday afternoon and the plant ran out of tan wire, so they're introducing a purple wire. Who knows? I've seen wire colors be wrong before, especially on mid-year model breaks, that kind of thing. Be careful using wiring color. But how do you determine that in the diagram? Well, typically next to the wire, you'll find a short code for color. BK, BK, TN, all the way up here. And then we have D/GN. It's a short code. A lot of times a diagram will have a legend, especially if you're working with a Euro and it doesn't even compute what they're trying to display in their short code. This is pretty obvious. BK on a ground circuit, most likely going to be black. TN, tan, makes sense, right? The reason why we see TN displayed so many times again is because we have a lot of connectors within this wiring itself, and we have to label the wire color on either side of the connector again because that could change as the wire travels from one side of the connector to the other. And then D/GN, maybe not as intuitive to figure out. GN probably means green. The D, in this case, actually means dark green, okay? They must use light green somewhere. Maybe they, ran out of wiring color, so they had to use dark green and light green on this vehicle. Happens to be the case, D/GN. Sometimes you can just Google it and see if something makes sense. But again, guys, if you get to the connector and you're looking for a dark green wire and there's none there, or there's 7 of them there, you have to use something else to determine where it is that we're in our circuit. The thing that has to always maintain or be maintained within the circuit has to be the wire's position within the connector. The pin location inside of the connector is what continues our continuity within the circuit. So our pin location is actually going to be, let's go ahead and erase all this. Our pin location here is actually labeled in a lot of these as a letter, but that's not always the case. You may see, you may see a number like at our BCM is pin 18, pin A, looks like pin K3 and J3, kind of interesting. Our horn assembly, A and B, but it doesn't show a connector. which is interesting. There's no connector shown, but we have to assume that there's a connector going to the horn assembly. You don't have to replace the wire harness if you're replacing a horn, right? That doesn't make sense. So that information is maybe not displayed, but apparently B is a dark green wire coming into our horn assembly. That's where we're going to be checking for power. And A is a black wire coming into our horn assembly. We would check there for ground. Pin location is going to give us our continuity through the circuit. If we change X to a 1, if we change our tan wire to pin F, we're no longer going to be part of this horn diagram circuit, okay? Something else is likely on pin F, or maybe it's empty. Pin location has to remain consistent. Now, to find that pin location can sometimes be tricky. Sometimes it just makes sense. Like you might have a 2-wire connector, and one is A and one is B. You may have a 50-wire connector at the BCM, and pin 18 is where? Is pin 1 in the upper left corner? Is pin 1 in the bottom right corner? Where do you start your counting to get to 18? Now, some connectors are really nice. They'll actually label out where pin 1 is and where maybe pin 63 is in the opposite corner, so you can know where to start counting from, but that's not always the case. Your best bet is to find a connector pinout diagram to be able to figure that out. Again, that's typically going to be found through a paid resource. It would look something like this. And you can see here pin 18 is just one of many wires going into our BCM, but pin 18 is part of this specific circuit. One other thing in this diagram that I guess I didn't think about talking about was some diagrams will contain safety messages for you. Typically, you'll find them described in some sort of legend, but right here is a, hey, be careful. The inflatable restraint steering wheel control module, the clock spring, does play with our airbag circuit, which makes sense, right? Steering wheel airbag makes perfect sense. So they're putting this little warning triangle in there to warn you that, hey, you're playing with potentially an airbag circuit, not on these specific tan wires at pin B, but on in this location. So just be careful. That's why you'll sometimes see warnings. You'll see that also on circuits that increase voltage, like with high voltage systems and hybrids, that kind of thing. Don't ignore the warnings, right? Safety first. All right, I think that's probably going to be about it for this horn circuit diagram. Again, if I've forgotten anything, if there's something in this diagram that doesn't make sense, if you need a further explanation, please put a comment down below, ask your question. I'll try to either answer it right in the YouTube comments, or I'll answer it in part 3 of our wiring diagram series. All right, let's bump into our next diagram. So what we've got up on the screen now is a ignition coil diagram for a 2014 Ford Taurus 3.5 liter. And this diagram I chose because there's information that's missing. So we're going to have to do a little bit of investigative understanding on this diagram to be able to determine what exactly is happening. So let's start out by labeling our major components within the circuit. We'll start out by doing the load, right? That's what we talked about. So we have coil on plug 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Those are the loads within our circuit. Our other major components, we have the powertrain control module, which is going to act as the computer in this circuit. And then we have the battery junction box, which in Ford terms is the fuse box that's found underneath the hood of the vehicle. Those are our major components, and then we have wiring in between. So I'll go ahead and clear that out. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and let's start tracing in our power at all times, right? We'll trace our red first. And we start up here at the battery, and I'm going to note this: hot, in start, or run. Hot in start or run. In the rest state, like we talked about in part 1, the vehicle is not key on, so it's not in the run position, and it's not in the start position. It is key out of the vehicle sitting by itself. So technically speaking, we do not have power on this circuit. We have switched power on this circuit. So Bernardo, this is another case where we're using switched power and switched ground on here, because technically speaking, we're dealing with what appears to be an open circuit traveling through here. So we'll go ahead and we're going to trace it in as blue. So A, we're starting at A. A means, and that triangle means that this continues on in another wiring diagram. That diagram number is 24-1. If we were troubleshooting this and we had a lack of power coming to fuse 68, key on, engine off, then we may continue on to diagram 24-1 and look for that A, because that's where that's going to match up with our circuit. But in this case, we will just work through this diagram today. So our switched power will flow down through fuse 68, which is a 20 amp fuse. We'll go down this violet VT, violet colored wire, which by the way, on newer diagrams, it's really nice that they will label the color with their short code, the VT, but then they'll also likely put the actual color of the wire in there. So VT being violet, VT in brown. VT-BN here means it's violet with a brown stripe. WH-BN is a white wire with a brown stripe. GNVT is green with a violet stripe. BU and OG, blue with orange stripe. Yellow-BU is yellow with a blue stripe, and WH and VT is white with a violet stripe. You'll typically see a wire with its solid color first and then the stripe color second. That's typically the way you'll find these written. Anyways, we're traveling down our violet wire. We get to connector 134. It appears to be pin 1 of connector 134. Connector 134 is going to be located where? Most likely we'll find connector 134 under the hood. It's a 100 series connector. Again, we can apply that rule of thumb we talked about earlier. Traveling down through our wiring, we get to S131. S is going to stand for splice. A splice is going to be where the wires branch out. We bring one wire in, we branch out to numerous wires. S131, again, likely found under the hood, and we'll transition our switched power to each of the ignition coils on the violet wire. So key on, engine off, engine running. We will actually show power to all 6 of our coils at the same time. Okay, that is our switched power. Again, we're doing switched power because we're hot in start or run only. We're not hot at all times. We're not connected to the battery. It's not powered at all times. In the rest position, we do not have power within this circuit. All right, let's go ahead and draw our ground. Do I have any volunteers that want to come up to the board and draw ground on this circuit? This is where we begin to run into issues, right? We don't have everything displayed within this diagram. This is where we need to start applying a little bit of logic, a little bit of understanding of how electrical works on a car to be able to decipher what is happening in this diagram, okay? Now, for cars that were made likely before I was born, people tell me if you leave the ignition switch on, you'll burn up the ignition coil. Now, I've never owned a car, really dating myself here, but I've never owned a car that ran a distributor. Did I just admit that? Anyways, I've never owned a car that ran a points distributor type of ignition setup. But in that setup, when you turn the key on, you supplied power to the coil, and when the points were closed, it had a ground path. If you left the key on and the points were closed, you would smoke the ignition coil, right? It would fry the coil eventually. It would get very hot. It would most likely create an open circuit within the coil. 2015, has anybody had any issues smoking a coil by leaving the key on? Likely not the case, right? That tells us 2 things. That tells us, 1, key on, engine off. We know we have power supplied to each of the coils. We know that for a fact, that we're supplying power when the key is in the start or run position. If we leave the key on, we have power at our coils. That tells me, thing number 2, that we are not grounding our coils at all times. These cannot be colored green. If they were, if we left the key on right now, coil unplug number 6 would fry itself, okay? Everybody following that? If the key was left on and we supplied it power anytime the key is on and it was grounded at all times, we would end up smoking that coil. Now there's another reason why we know that's not green at all times. If it were grounded at all times, we would never create spark, because the principle of an ignition coil, we supply it power, we supply it ground, we build up this magnetic field. In the event of taking one of those away, either power or ground, our magnetic field kind of freaks out and has to go somewhere. It collapses onto the secondary windings, where it then travels through the boot or the spark plug wire and across the spark plug gap, creating that spark. If we don't have that removal of power or removal of ground, we don't have spark. The vehicle does not run, okay? Are we turning the key off every time we want to create spark. That doesn't make any sense at all, right? No, that's not the case. We have to be controlling the ground side of the circuit. Okay? That has to be happening within our powertrain control module. So even though it's not physically displayed within this diagram that we're using a switched ground circuit on the other side of our coils, we can guesstimate that that's what's happening. A lot of times you can kind of piece it together, figure it out. It's like putting a puzzle together, figuring out what's missing in that diagram. In this case, we're missing a way to control the ignition coil. We're feeding all 6 coils through a splice right here, power at all times. We have to be switching the ground side, which tells me that I can go ahead and draw all 6 of these with a switched ground circuit. Okay, so that'll come into here and we'll just draw like a little switch for each. Now it's likely that the PCM somewhere has a ground at all times. That's likely. It doesn't have to be the case. It could have a switched ground, but it's likely. So, I mean, it's likely that we run something that looks like this inside there. So when the PCM goes ahead and commands it, similar to the way the relay works, we will drop our switch here, we'll connect, and then we'll go ahead and apply ground to our coil, like so. Something like that. Again, we're kind of inferring what's happening inside of the PCM, but logically, it makes sense. We have to switch our ground side control to our coil on plugs in order for them to function, in order to have spark. If we weren't switching the ground side, the car would not run. Simple as that. Okay? Sometimes in a diagram, you have to take the time and figure out what's not being shown to you. You got to take the puzzle, try to put it together, and then fill in the blanks. Now, I'm not saying that you're always going to be right. I'm not always right with what's not being shown. Sometimes it's a guessing game. Sometimes you actually do have to test to figure out what it is that you're seeing to apply it to the diagram. Sometimes that's the case. Not always. But in this case, I am 99.9% certain that we are switching the ground circuit to each of the coil on plugs. Even though it's not displayed, even though it's not on paper, even though it's not given to me by the engineer who designed this vehicle, I'm 99.9% sure that is how it functions based on the logic and understanding of how an ignition coil functions. Okay? All right, I hope that makes sense for everybody. If it doesn't, I'd be happy to dig in deeper in part 3. But I think, guys, now it is time, for the t-shirt giveaway question. All right, it's going to be related to this wiring diagram right here. I'll go ahead and clear our mess off of here. All right, this diagram right here, this vehicle. 2 technicians are discussing a cylinder 3 misfire diagnosis. They're performing their testing with the key turned on, engine off. They're using a multimeter. The black lead is connected to battery ground, and the red lead is mounted onto pin 50 of the PCM. The meter is reading 12.3 volts. Technician A says the circuit is shorted to power and is going to require further investigation. Technician B says the ignition coil primary circuit checks out good under these current conditions. Who's correct? Tech A, Tech B, both technicians, or neither? Now, in your response that you email off to me, I want to know why. I want an explanation. I don't want just Tech A or Tech B. If you don't include an explanation as to why one is right, either they're both right or neither are right, if you don't include why, you're not going to be eligible to win the t-shirt giveaway, okay? The first 5 of you that send me off an email that I receive that is correct and explains why this is occurring will win a t-shirt. If you already won, if you won a GoTech t-shirt last time, you can go ahead and give this a shot, but your name will be moved down the list. I'm going to get people who haven't won a shirt yet the ability to win. So our deadline is going to be tonight at midnight, so 13 hours after video release here will be our deadline for our t-shirt giveaway. Again, the first 5 correct answers will win a GoTech t-shirt. And remember, we do have a pocketed t-shirt now, and we do have a non-pocketed t-shirt. So let me know what you guys want. All right, so I think that's gonna about do it here for part 2 of our wiring diagram series. Again, guys, if you have questions of how we figured anything out on here. If you have questions regarding the horn circuit diagram, please bring them up in the comments section below. I'll be happy to try to answer them there, or I will get them answered in part 3 of our diagram series, where we're going to dive into a different type of diagram. All right, so I really appreciate you guys watching. If you did enjoy the video, if you learned something today, if you thought it was fun to watch, whatever it might be, give us a thumbs up, please. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Clicking on that little bell icon will get you a notification every time we come out with a new video, including part 3 of our wiring diagram series here. Again, guys, I really, really appreciate you watching. Thank you so much for being there. And as always, happy wrenching, everyone. Thank you.